Welcome to the first episode of Cyber Oinks. Today we're doing 12 questions with a cyber expert. Our expert today is Stefan Lesaru. He's been in several CISO roles and he's been doing security for a long time now. He's also a good friend of mine. I'm really happy to have you today, Stefan. Thanks for joining us. How are you feeling today?
All good. Yeah, thank you for the intro, David. Pleasure to meet you again virtually and
Nice,
in the
nice.
podcast. Unfortunately, I've been doing this for longer than I want to admit. I've started with industry when mainframes were still being used widely, which is happening today. Moved through the from systems data centers and everything else in between to networking, and then identity asset management, which is the area of focus over the past 20 some years. As you mentioned, held previous roles in different organizations, from like operational to delivery, consulting, and advisory roles.
Yeah.
So right now, from a cybersecurity perspective, it's a fairly interesting landscape. It's way too connected compared to what it used to be, and that poses its own set of challenges. So hopefully,
Yes,
we'll see things moving forward.
indeed. So, as I said, what we're doing today is 12 questions. Just to briefly explain the concept, like we've talked about it before, but so that we also give this idea to everyone who's listening. I'm going to ask you a few questions. There's going to be 12 of them, actually. It's questions that I've compiled together based on what I've actually met in the industry to be some of the topics that kind of seem, I think, to people that are not in the cyberspace and not in the industry, that should have been answered already, but are not. People have different opinions about them. We see experts sort of having difference of sort of philosophies about this kind of stuff. And to make it a bit more cheeky, what I thought we would do is to put it in a way, frame it in a way where it's either a yes or no. I'll give you sort of two or three options and you kind of have to pick one. The reason why is because in cybersecurity, it's a lot about prioritization, right? There's always a lot of the times there are situations where you kind of want to do multiple things, but you can't. You have to pick one or the other. And so that's why I went with this multiple choice format for, one for to be a bit cheeky, and the other reason because that actually makes sense from a priority perspective.
Correct. Yeah, the nature of the
So the rules of the game, I ask you the question. I'm going to ask you to respond sort of like yes or no, or option A, option two, and then maybe say a few words about what the reason for your answer is so that there's some insight that people who are listening can take away. But we're going to keep things short because we want to kind of make this a sort of a quick and dirty type of a situation, right? Does that
yeah,
sound good?
sounds good. Perfect.
Exactly. All right. So before we get into the actual questions, I'm going to have one warm-up question for you, just to kind of test that you can actually answer them when you want it. If you had to pick one, would you rather watch a full game of lacrosse or a UFC fight?
The UFC fight.
Okay, good. And why?
Well, lacrosse, it's still the fighting happening, but at the same time, I think it's a bit more entertaining on the UFC side of it. Right? So it's just the contact sport context, and it's just basically, well, it's one of those things. So lacrosse has
Yeah,
rules. UFC
right.
has
Yeah.
rules, but let's keep them.
It's more surprising, I guess you could say.
I think, yeah, it offers a bit more
All
entertainment
right, good.
aspect.
Okay, so we've done the technical check that we can actually do this. So let's get into the actual questions. Last 5 years especially, we've seen a huge uptake of bring your own device policies. It's kind of becoming the norm that it has become the norm that people expect to use their own devices and bring them to the workspace. For a lot of security professionals, it's been a nightmare. But anyway, it's there. And I guess the question that I have here is, if you had to pick one, would you prefer a good buyout policy or a managed devices only policy for an organization? Which wins your vote, basically?
The former, they bring your own policy, bring your own device with the proper policy in place. It's
Okay, and why is that?
it's inevitable anyway. I've been working in the industry like that a long time. Bring your own devices in the era of Palm Pilots and, for example, BlackBerry. Just
Hmm.
because of the nature of the devices, everyone wanted the latest and greatest, but because of feature function difference, you always had that gap. And people
Right.
are relative. And again, these days, technology compared to years ago does allow you to manage devices, your own or the enterprise device. And majority of the times, companies that are really strict on security, like let's say government organizations or military or whatever agencies, in the intelligence area, they have their own devices to actually do the actual work. And then the other part to it, it's basically if you are an individual that works, a contractor will have, you can bring your own device, but you cannot touch anything in that environment in terms of the work. So you can do meetings or other things that are mundane, quote unquote,
Yep.
but the rest of it, any work that's work to be done on the actual essential in the environment, needs to be with their own devices.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All
So
right. Thank you.
sure.
That's an interesting way of perspective. That's actually something that I have to say, I like the business aspect of looking at things. You know, it's sometimes easy to say let's kind of like keep the castle as protected as possible, but on the other hand, I think that's sort of when the reality hits you in the face because
Correct. And
it
let's be
just
honest.
ends up happening anyway a lot of the times, right? It's just not really under the control, right?
Correct. And if you look at the environments, just a brief note, if you look at the environments, even managed environments, you have a lot of workarounds. So if you have a power user, administrator, or whatnot, they'll find ways around your policies no matter what.
Yep.
DLP, it's a prime example. Data loss prevention, it's a prime example as to why it didn't work because it was always bypassable. So you could
Right.
always find a hole into, or a bypass, a gap, whatever you want to call it, into the product. So even the product's being locked down, you had a bunch of capital expenditure or operation expenditures and so on, and still had data that was leaked. So did it make
Yeah.
sense to invest millions and still have poor results?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. All right, next question. The mantra goes people, process, technology, right? That's sort of the anyone in the cybersecurity space sort of throws around. Now, if you had to pick one, which one would you recommend your typical, let's say, SMB should focus on primarily and the most? Where should most of the energy go?
Process. Most of the times, again, that we've heard it time and again with the advent of AI, everyone is like, oh, people are the weakest link. At the end of the day,
Hmm.
people, yes, could be the weakest link, but if your processes are not defined or do not function because they've been defined 20 years ago or 10 years ago or whenever, and they're never reviewed, processes fails the most. Like if you look at the take airline industry or spaceships industry, all right, when things are being launched, well, they have a process. They go by, they check everything. If it's not checked out, it doesn't pan out, and it's actually an issue, won't fly, won't take off. Period. We'll go back and fix whatever. Yeah, a human might have forgot to put to fuel the oxygen tank or whatever the case might be, right? Or left a trap open or whatever. But at the end of the day, the process is the process. If you go through the motions, you do you do have the checks and balances in place, and you can prevent both the technology issues or the human issues, or you can at least
Absolutely.
mitigate
Yeah.
them, not necessarily prevent.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I guess just to add on sort of from my side, also see that it's really easy for this for the process piece to be something that's sort of done on the paper and not actually followed through, and especially after some period of time, right? That it's one of those things that's, as you said, like it kind of brings us back to the question before, right? You may have a very strict buyout policy, but people will find ways to make their life easier. That's sort of like human nature. And if the process is maybe somewhat cumbersome, and even for good reasons, people will find ways to just sort of do make their life easier and do things just a way it just feels better for them, right?
Right. And if you look at process, like especially bigger organizations, let's say are different species, so to speak. But if you look at small, medium businesses, they do not, most of them don't have processes. One. Second,
Mm-hmm.
even if the process exists, people will be like, I'll do it because Stefan doesn't do it well, David does it better. But I've worked with individuals that even in bigger organizations that had their own process, but they couldn't fix the stuff they were breaking, for example, or one was broken, no one knew what they were doing. So if the process is the same across, you have same type of technology, same type of procedures and so on, it's easier to basically address the issue of response in case of something happening. You can fix the issue, you can address them quickly, and whomever leaves the organization, joins the organizations, it's actually in the loop. They know what's happening, and to your point, things may be obsolete. If you make the effort to actually do it properly and you do realize that you need to update, you'll have a better posture.
Okay. Let's move to the next question. And I guess let's move to the managed services space, or maybe I should say the managed security services space. It's from my experience, it's quite common that MSP customers sort of expect, because they don't understand IT and cybersecurity too well, they sometimes expect that the MSP sort of has their back when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think there are indications and sort of things that the MSPs do that kind of give that sort of, give that perception, and it's somewhat justified that customers expect this. And they don't, but then on the other side, what I also see is a lot of MSPs, they don't actually see, and they don't actually have it contractually. It's not in the contract, basically, that the MSP takes care of the company's cyber risks, right? And so what I'm seeing is sort of this conflict between the perceptions of what customers think is happening and what is actually happening sort of from the MSP side. And I guess
That's true.
my question is, do you agree with this? Is this the way you perceive the world as well? And if so, why do you think it's the case?
So definitely I agree with the fact that when organizations outsource, for example, or have an MSSP, a security service provider, taking the role in the organization, they have the expectation they'll manage the landscape from a cybersecurity perspective. The main challenge with that, and that's the caveat, the client may have the expectation. Most of the organizations started in the managed service provider space, not security.
Hmm.
So that's part one. Second, contractually, a lot of the times things are not specifically mentioned in the contract, and there's a false expectation on the client side that they will actually get the service, especially when things go south, when something
Yep.
happens, there's an incident and so on, and that's actually where things come to light in all the contractual arrangements and the relationship between the service providers and the clients. And again, I've worked with MSSPs, MSPs from a vendor perspective, client perspective, and also I was working with one of them for one of them, or for some of them. But the challenge I'm seeing is the expectation. Cyber risk is very broad, right? Especially this day and age. And there are multiple parties involved. There is no clear delineation, and that's clients that are successful into agreeing on the RACI roles, the responsibilities, accountability,
Yeah.
consultative, and informative charts. They have a better idea as to. But your point and the question was focused on the expectation. There's always a
Mm-hmm.
false expectation that the client has entitlement to anything if I manage, let's say, their Okta or the RIM platform. But again, if
Mm-hmm.
that's an issue with the platform and that platform resides in the cloud, that's not the MSSP's or MSP's problem, right? But again, if the MSP doesn't, one, have the relationship, doesn't understand quickly what the issue is, it takes too long to resolve and address the issues. And again, back to some of the question about the process. If you do have the process defined and things in place, contractually or otherwise, things get resolved. Otherwise, it's very challenging, especially when everyone it's with the hair on fire, proverbially speaking. It's really tough to take decisions and get to the bottom of it and fix the issue at hand and move on. I think that's one of the challenges with the MSPs. And again, then you have the contractual. Everyone looks at the dollars and the expenditure, the expenditures, and so on. But at the end of the day, doesn't mean if you have the lowest cost is the poorest service, or if you have the highest cost is the best service. You have to know
Yep.
the organization, have to establish that relationship and check. Like I've worked with plenty of organizations, small or big, or government organizations or academia. The ones that are good at what they're doing and they establish good relationships. One, second,
Mm-hmm.
they do negotiate their contracts properly, and they understand where they have gaps, where the service providers need to provide the additional help, if you will. Be
Yep.
it in the just expertise and brain picking when something happens. See the
Yep.
Microsoft incident when they offered the help with the CrowdStrike, Microsoft CrowdStrike, they offered the help to certain organizations and they declined it. Like, well,
Yep.
nothing you can do at that point.
Absolutely. Okay, coming back to general sort of cybersecurity. We're talking priorities this whole time. Should companies first master prevention or response?
I think they should master response. Most organizations have enough technology in place or they know how to prevent things. Let's say you shouldn't leave someone going through your doors physically unless they have a badge or you know them or whatever. We know that happens. It's been happening since the ages. Back to the fortress, right? People always found a way to get in the fortress, a Trojan horse or otherwise disguised as a merchant, you name it. But if you do the response part of it and you master that, you have a better chance of actually not have everything collapse in front of your eyes. And
Mm-hmm.
it's challenging. It's everyone. It's all thinking. Let's prevent. You can't prevent. Cyber risk cannot be avoided. Period. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Having 100% something that's secure, sure, unplug everything, lock it in a room, a couple of 100 meters below concrete, and you should be okay. You may not have. It's probably close to 100% it can get. But if you are connected, if you have everything, you should be able to respond. And if you
Mm-hmm.
look at incidents, like if you look at again, I'll pick on CrowdStrike and Microsoft incident, people didn't realize, one, how to respond, and actually the magnitude of the issue. And it took
Mm-hmm.
too long to get to the point, and it's too late. I mean, you can manage the risk, but when you can't
Right.
respond quickly enough, is put it this way: the man Sully Sullenberg, right, that landed the plane on the Hudson River in New York
Mm-hmm.
years ago. He was told he shouldn't be doing that. All that with all that, he took the decision to do it. Everyone got away unscathed. The plane, it's actually in a museum now. There is the flip
Mm-hmm.
side of it when someone followed the process and had an incident, and that's the flight Swiss 111 years ago, again, around 98. He was told to dump the fuel over the area near the airport and return right back because he had the fire on board. He was like, no, I'll go by the rules and I'll go over the international waters or whatever and dump fuel over the water. Too late, everyone perished on that flight.
Yep.
So again, incident response, it's a tricky and finicky situation. Even experienced
Yep.
individuals may not be able to take the best decision for the circumstance. But again, practicing and training everyone to actually respond properly. Like if you look at the military or SWAT teams and so on, that's what they do. It's actually incident
Mm-hmm.
response versus incident mitigation. They can't mitigate. It's not their purview to mitigate, but they have to respond.
On this note, there's always a big debate around what takes the lead, take the lead, education or technology. What's your perspective on this?
So I think education combined with technology. The challenge is a lot of times technology it's actually being implemented ahead of any education. And again, I understand that part, but I'll give you a best example from years ago. We had technology and I worked with a bunch of execs, right? And BlackBerry was the hottest thing you could get your hands on. Technology was there, but was going way ahead of the actual educational process. So everyone was actually
Mm-hmm.
using device for more than, and by what they're using the device for more than was designed, I mean, just they sold more devices than was needed because everyone wanted to make the numbers and they wanted more market share, right? But at the same time, the technology in the background was just not barely holding. I mean, it held really well. But what I'm getting to, it's like education wasn't necessarily, and I'm not talking about education on the end users. I'm talking education on the
Mm-hmm.
actual organizations. And that's, I think, part of the problem because at the time I had the privilege to work with the execs, right? So there are people that taking the decision for the entire organization. It's a big organization worldwide. Uh, but the challenge was they understood when they ran into glitches, half the room, and you had all the partners in a firm, right? And half of them had no issues and they're texting and doing stuff while not paying attention to the meetings, and half of them were like up in hours. Why? And there was an event in Toronto at the time because I live in Toronto area. There was an
Mm-hmm.
event. They just jumped the entire. There are too many BlackBerry devices for the capacity. Think highways, right? When they get jammed, too many cars on the road. Well, you only have 60 lanes on one way, but if all 60 are full, that's it, right? You reach capacity.
Yep.
So education is not
Yep.
necessarily end user. It's also, hey, how much you put on that infrastructure. So technology, it's normally misperceived as well, resolves all the issues. Not
It's
necessarily.
like it's there and just sort of that's good enough, but
Right. Yeah, back to the
it's
expectation.
it's rarely the case that in itself will basically solve your problems. You have to know how to. They're just tools, and you got to know how to use them, right?
And I had individuals, for example, telling me identity and access management. I'll give you the best example. It's a fairly expensive technology, and your pay gets into the identity and access management to the pastoralist part of it. But someone was making the analogy, oh, well, the service should be a chip. It should be like when I flip the switch on the back in my behind me on the wall. It was like, well, do you realize how much infrastructure is there? Like,
Yeah.
well, if someone hits the pole or something happens and you have a ice storm and everything collapses, well, you have the switch on the wall. It's useless. It's the rest
Yep.
of it. It's not the technology necessarily. It's also the other part. So it's a
Yep.
balance, and you
Absolutely.
always kind of have to look at the balancing act as to which comes first, chicken or the egg,
Yep.
right?
Yeah. So I'll note that as the first question that you didn't actually answer in a yes or no, or option one or option B. You choose both options. I'm joking.
And for like if you look like technology, Nortel it's a huge used to be a huge Canadian company, but their technology was way ahead of its time in terms of
Hmm.
networking, where they grew, they had their own technology, which was really revolutionary for the time. They just basically went from like billions of dollars business to zero. So they were bankrupt
Yep.
in no time because the education aspect of it with their clients, with the actual personnel and so on, and the sales teams wasn't there.
Yep.
So it's just
Yep.
basically not the product. The technology was fantastic for its time, but the educational
Hmm.
part. So I agree to put the technology first when it makes sense, but then quickly follow up with the educational factor. Otherwise, you'll
Right.
fail.
Yep. Let's talk threats. Ransomware is a big topic, justifiably so, I think. Not all topics that are, not all buzzwords actually should be buzzwords. This one, I think, deserves to be heard, let's say. Last year, we're seeing the numbers. First of all, the volume is increasing. The percentage of successful breaches that actually involve ransomware is also increasing. So that it's a hugely important topic. My question is, when it comes to battling ransomware, and considering the fact that the numbers are rising, do you see that it's sort of time to innovate, or is it to optimize and find better ways to use existing tech?
So first optimize. I'd pick first optimize because again, the tendency in the industry has been 40 years, for as long as I can remember, it's always been the new shiny toy. The challenge
Hmm.
with new shiny toys, like they're all, a lot of them are great, but if you don't optimize, you have, it's like you get a great home, it's energy efficient and everything, but you love to have the flow of air going through your house every day. So it's like, well, you leave the windows wide open. So again, optimization, I think it makes the most sense because again, it's costing you nothing. You already have an investment. You already have a huge, and these days, actually, speaking of stats, right, a lot of companies from an investment perspective, they have an average of 50 plus cybersecurity products in their environments. Rarely as a vendor, managed service provider, client, I've seen the optimization. On the client side, for example, just because
Hmm.
I was a client for one of the companies here, a couple of them, it offered me the flexibility as a client to look at things and discuss with my management, say, look, here's what we have. Why you add this tool? Because someone else wants it. Sure, if it makes sense, we'll
Hmm.
look at it. If it's a niche product or needs to be addressing a gap, let's see if we can talk to the other vendors, see if they have this on the roadmap. If not, sure, we're all fine to get the new part in. But otherwise, optimization would be key because you keep adding. And the other part, it's
Right.
clutter.
Yep.
It's like hoarding. Put someone having, again, back to the home. You keep hoarding and you keep
Yep.
adding stuff. You have a nice, empty, livable space, and all of a sudden you have boxes to the walls and to the ceilings. And it's like, well, where are
It's
the walls?
it's much harder to manage a lot of things than few things, right?
Yeah, and like it's essentially the keys, right? Keep it simple without the last part, without all that. But at the end of
Yeah.
the day, technology, that's the other flip side. On the optimization, the silver lining is that you might have acquired technology that 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago had a business purpose. Today, for
Hmm.
example, it may not. When you look at
Right.
those things, you have to determine, do you still spend something or you,
Reiterating and getting rid of stuff, basically, right? I think that's a big topic. Is And if you look at it from a vendor perspective, I mean, I'm on the vendor side, and I guess a lot of the times vendors sort of pick their markets and pick the next product that they create to be something that doesn't replace anything, right? And
and
that kind of helps the whole piling situation because you basically end up having a lot of different tools that are sort of all seem like they're all complementary, but then it becomes much harder to manage and actually use, right?
right. And that's a very valid point, right? Because if you look at the keep adding over the years, again, I've been in the vendor side of it and dealt with the architecture aspect, either like security architecture, enterprise architecture, any type solution architecture. And if you look at that, I had clients literally, and they've been my clients for 12 plus years, a lot of them. And you're telling them when you're implementing a solution, review the architecture because what's valid today, let's say every 12 to 18 months maximum, review it.
Yep.
I have to say, and I can look anyone in the eyes of my clients, I have architecture that's still today, and it's valid reasons, but they kept not optimizing even that architecture. And if you think architecture is not just putting system, it's putting technology, putting software in. And if that's not being reviewed, then what? Your business model may change, right? You went from full on-site to remote. Well, do you really
Yep.
need all the on-site? And organizations
I'm
don't.
gonna sidetrack.
Correct.
I'm gonna sidetrack a bit with a note here. What you're talking about, Stefan, is a very important perspective on cybersecurity that I feel can sometimes be a bit forgotten, let's say, and that's the architectural piece of everything, right? Because I think fundamentally it is about architecture,
Yeah.
and you need the process to manage risk, and you need to be able to have a methodology to be able to make prioritize and make decisions. But at the end of the day, a big piece of securing IT systems, because they are IT systems, is about architecture. And I think this is a very valid point, that it's absolutely important to not forget that, you need to look at an architectural perspective on your business, basically.
Yeah. So it's both business architecture and technology architecture, right? Take
Yep.
AI, right? Everyone speaks about AI. Ask anyone to draw a diagram for the architecture for AI. I mean, fairly simple: interface, processing, and then the servers. So not too many elements, regardless of where those elements sit. But 80/20, 90% of the people, it's like, oh, it's something there. It's like, no, it's not. I pull the plug on the data lake, you're done. Like you have zero. Or I
Yep.
kill the interface and then introduce something there, some malware or whatever. I can manipulate whatever correct data you have in the backend. Doesn't matter.
Yep.
Then that makes it harder to secure and mitigate the risk, because people don't
Yep.
understand what the bits and pieces are.
It's a very interesting topic that I would like to hear your perspective. I mean, maybe let's leave it to the end. It's something that I wasn't planning on, to be honest with you, but it's something that's very interesting to me. But coming back to the ransomware topic, to pay or not to pay, basically, is the question. What's your perspective on this?
I mean, not to pay. I'm all for, well, okay, take whatever. The challenge is I would vote for not to pay. The issue I've seen in the industry for the past, I'd say more than five, and I've been in situations where I've seen it happening firsthand with organizations I've been in and clients. The main issue is like, sure, not to pay sounds good on paper. The challenge is, what's the risk and what's the impact? And again, a response back to some of the previous questions. If you have those things in place, the other side of it with pay, organizations don't even declare these days. They'll pay and move on with it, right? The medium security breach these days, it's about median 4.5 million US, around there. So let's say 4 million euros, just for the ballpark. Organizations look at, and the executives that take those decisions look at it and say, yeah, okay, what's the likelihood of me being hit by a ransomware?
Mhm.
Okay, like winning the lottery. Great. Okay, I'm not spending anything. When it happens, you have cyber insurance. I think the pay part of it, with blindly taking that risk, it's twofold. First, cybersecurity insurance starts to be dependent on you having the actual measures in place to prove to the insurance company that you've done everything. One, you had all the people, process, technologies in place, and then you've taken all the
Super
measures from a
so.
response perspective to be able to respond uh,
Right.
correctly. And someone made,
It doesn't.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, it doesn't solve you the problem, because
Yeah,
it's like, if you haven't done enough, you haven't done enough, right? And that's one thing, but the other thing, it's not just the direct cost,
correct.
right?
It's
It's
the
it's
reputation,
not just
brand,
it's like the ransom piece of it is just
just
like this much, basically,
better.
but the
Yeah,
bigger piece is the response piece. And actually, even if you're doing it right, it's still expensive, right?
right.
It's not like it doesn't cost you anything. It's just a matter of when it costs you.
And I think one of the issues that most of us, speaking of the response, and this being brought to my attention as we discussing to a cyber response company, companies that respond quick but do not know what's actually behind the threat vector or the attack pattern, like the APT or enabler, advanced persistent threat and whatnot, they will actually miss the flag, because essentially you close avenues for the attacker to get in, but you don't know what their goal is. So actually, they're doing the research, and they're saying about 80% of organizations that respond quickly, their time to recover it's actually longer. The reason for,
Mhm.
because the attacker realized,
Right.
oh, you have defenses against this and you have defenses against that. Oh, but you don't have defenses there. So I'll wait until things settle down and dust settle 2 days and you think you're okay, and then I'll just go through that and get right in, exfiltrate quickly, and we're done.
Yeah.
So it's
By the way, one thing, this is just sort of maybe more on the not to pay side of the argument, but I forget the statistic or source right now, to be honest with you. But apparently many of the situations where companies decide to pay, they actually end up being victims of another ransomware event because they've already proven, I think one part of it may be the motivation, which is they've already proven that they have the willingness to pay. So
Right.
they are a good target indeed. And second of all, which is, I think, something that's not talked about so much, which is the technical reason behind it, is at the end of the day, this is all systems and code that's sitting somewhere. And just because you pay and it doesn't mean that the malware isn't still there somewhere, and you may not know where it is, right? That's the issue.
At the end of the day, you are dealing with people that are bent to do harm, right? They're on the other side of the equation. So there's no guarantee for you that things will actually, as soon as you pay your ransomware, the data will be restored. It's already been sold in certain
Right.
situations, right? The other
That's
part
another
to it,
problem, right?
you're right. So if you look at the MSP, MSSP's equation, if you don't have actually a good response, cybersecurity incident response that actually has good connections on the dark web, they've been established there for years, whatnot, there is virtually zero guarantee that what you're actually paying for will actually be fully reimbursed to you. So it's not the physical part that, oh yeah, I'll get all my data back and there's no other copy anywhere else. Like, yeah, wish for that to happen. So it's hard. So not to pay would be the vote, but again, unfortunately, the reality is like it's a risk thing, and the executives will be like, oh yeah, we'll spend the shareholders' money or whomever, it's a private equity, that's fine, just to not get the
Yep.
black regulations with the SEC. They need to report California and a couple of others, or European Union. You are based in Europe. GDPR and a couple of other regulations do have the actual financial teeth, if you will. So you get fined if you bypass the regulation and you've done things, but that otherwise
Yep.
will fly under the radar. But it's getting harder, right? As things get more connected. And again, the ransomware and the attacks are part of the daily life for any organization.
Yep.
So
Coming back to MSPs for a second, when a breach happens of any sort, who do you think should bear the cost? Should it be the MSP, or let me say the MSSP? So let's say it is the situation where there is clear expectations that are set in advance and are well communicated by both sides, or should it be the customer?
normally it's the customer. So, and not that I like to say that, but the challenge is if, unless it's contractually really precise and it can be determined that was on the MSP, MSSP side of the equation,
Mhm.
basically it's actually the customer's responsibility and cost to bear. Um,
I think the question that I'm just to sort of make sure we're sort of talking about the same thing. The reason why I'm asking the question is the word should. Do you think it should be the MSSP or should it be the customer? What's sort of the ideal scenario from your perspective?
so the ideal scenario, in an ideal world, it should be the service provider. It's like your mechanic, right? So I, as a professional, and again, I've been through MSPs and work with them. So if you are the actual professional company that does this, in theory, it should be the MSP, MSSP. Again,
Mhm.
there are ways of negotiating and making sure you put it in the contract if you didn't have it. So I misunderstood the question. So it's kind of, I'm looking at the contractual aspects or the background and
Yeah, I see what you mean. You're looking at the more well, like what happens sort of in practice
the actual.
is, I
Don't.
guess,
Yeah.
what happens in practice a lot, I guess, is it ends up being on the customer side, right? So that's
Correct.
I'm
Yeah.
sort of more heading towards what you think should be the norm. If it's, I think on there are sort of two arguments to this as I see it. At least the two arguments that I can think of, which is on the one side, it's that it should be the MSSP because they are, in fact, there taking responsibility and helping out the customer with cybersecurity. But on the other side, which is the other side of the argument, it's the customer that can actually, in fact, factually do stuff
Right.
to endanger the mission, right? Because they're actually it's the organizations that's actually doing the things, right? So
Right.
that's sort of what I'm heading at here.
And the nuance I think there, like if you look at the black and white world, right? It's like, okay, the MSSP said and had everything contractually and whatnot, then they should take the cost. But then, like I was starting to answer, if you look at what's not in the contract, okay, depends on how grave that is, how the issue can be addressed and whatnot. You can provide pro bono assistance, all that. But if the
Mhm.
client, for example, endangers the known environment by like KnowBe4 and a couple of other organizations, right? You are the one hiring, right? If you are hiring someone that you didn't vet properly, then regardless of what the MSSPs or MSPs have contractually, they cannot prevent your own fault.
Right.
So it's very nuanced. So the challenge with overall life, but the industry in general and cybersecurity now being so sectioned. One, organizations don't talk among themselves between the silos. That's one part. But then they think that they threw it over the fence and they have zero responsibility for it. It's like, well, you still have to vet your people, not to hire people that will actually sell your information legitimately because they have access to
Mhm.
the system. So it's like, well, what do you want me to do? Even if you fire that
Yep.
person, they've done enough damage. So
It's already done.
it's very nuanced. And again, if you go by the book in terms of nomenclature, like I have managed security service providers, yes, they should mind the security, but it's going to be always the security force they sign up for. The
Yep.
clients will overstep their capabilities to execute, and that's where things fall short, and so on. But again, if you talk to the clients, you understand what the client does not have, and what they have capabilities for, then at least you can either bring your own resources, advise the client how to bring their own resources, and so on. So there is always that communication part that needs to happen.
Yep.
Otherwise, if it's static, it's very hard to address, especially when in the crisis situations.
Yep. Let's do the next one quick. Password policies. How frequently do you think passwords should be changed to make sure, for them to actually prevent breaches?
Well,
What's the right password policy?
I'd say passerless, but that's fine. That's beside the point. I'm not putting anyone's
That's
sword.
it.
Literally speaking, like password policies, uh, and there are actually statistics these days that prove it. They don't make any difference. The organizations that have really strict password policies, they change it every. The norm in the industry it's about 30, anywhere between 30 to 90 days. So you have most of the accepted norm in the industry. Any organization I've dealt with, it's about 90 days. So about 4 passwords a year, right? And you don't rotate for
Mhm.
the next 20 years, that thing, whatever the case may
Yeah.
be. The challenge with the complexity and so on, we're humans, so we'll forget things. If you have MFA and a couple of other things in place, well, we know how that played for some of the casinos in Vegas. So that's fairly easy to address and deal with. But the other part to it is like any password policy, back to my comment earlier, if I hire someone that keeps all this policy, but I'm a hired hacker and I'm black hat,
Mhm.
not white hat, and I work for some countries in this world, then that's an issue to begin with. So regardless of how strict your process, again, back to process, you've changed your password policy. How effective is it? Most organizations, if you look at it, they don't track how effective those password policies are. They don't
Actually are. Yep.
they rarely revise the password policy. And
Yep.
someone makes the
So
comment about that. Sorry.
so the reason why I'm asking about this, I'm gonna give you sort of insight into the background of this question, is because it actually turns out that there are, from my perspective, two conflicting NIST guidelines regarding password policy, where one of them says you shouldn't have it, you shouldn't rotate passwords, and the other one says, and that's the important part, you shouldn't do it at all, right? And the other
Yeah,
one says, um, you do it in some period of time X, right? It doesn't really matter whether
correct.
it's
But you
30
should do
days
it.
or 90 days, I don't think, but you should do it, right?
Right.
And I think that's really interesting because it tells you something about what's happening. There are different threats and different risks that are associated with each, right?
Correct. Yeah. And that's that to your point, NIST, for example, same as any other government organization, if you look at a lot of regulations, there is either conflicting or overlapping or kind of obsolete based on the news the reality, right?
Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
and unfortunately, I have to agree with both. Yes, you should change it, but at the same time, don't even bother because at the end of the day, if you are really in someone's crosshairs, they'll get to you no matter what. So you should be doing other things that password policy is the list of your worries, essentially, at that point. Um,
Yep.
and that's fairly, yeah. And if you look at 853, I think is the NIST for access control, like all the standard for identity access management and all the controls, physical and digital. That's
Yep.
exactly one of the things, right? And you'll fail an audit if someone says, well, you should have changed it
Well,
X.
exactly.
Really, but I have a
That's
lot
why
of,
that's exactly why I'm posing the question, and it's sort of like yes or no, because that's exactly a situation where you can't not decide, right? That's why
right.
it's important to sort of have those
You should
questions, the
have,
hard questions.
like, if you look at organizations, unfortunately, audit does require to have a policy for password management. And
Yep.
most projects do have it, but again, adjust and revise how efficient they are and move on. And if there's
Yep.
new technology, don't even worry. Like basically to your point, like the technology that Fake offers or CyberArk or anyone else on this world, right? They have certificates, they have other methods. and mechanisms. So
Yep.
it's on those.
Yep. Yep. The next one's about liability, and I'm going to use the example of passwords again to sort of make things simple. When a user does something we all fear, just takes their password and uses it outside of their organizations for one of their own personal accounts,
Right.
and it's exposed, and it's actually ends up being reason for the breach. Who's at fault from your perspective?
That's a loaded question. I mean, most of the times, practically speaking, the user would be at fault. It's because you signed a lot of policies, you signed a lot of NDAs. The challenge is the refreshers or the hey, you're a high-end security analyst for some financial organization or for some government agency and so on. You should know better. You'll be a target. So
Yep.
I think, practically speaking, the user is liable. Practically and theoretically speaking, the user is liable
Yep.
for using stuff in that's work related in a personal environment, and the other way around. That
Yep.
goes both ways. But the main challenge is how do you prove? And actually, that's one of the issues lately when, for example, Lloyd, which is one of the biggest insurers in the world, said they won't provide cyber insurance for nation-sponsored attacks. Well,
Mm-hmm.
the immediately the law community came up with, like, obviously lawyers are highly paid individuals to prove that one party is wrong and the other side is right. But the challenge came right off the bat. It's like, well, how do you prove? Because in certain situations, it's hard to prove that. Hard
Yep.
to say, yeah, you owe me, Lloyd, you owe me millions. So same with the individuals. If I don't admit,
Yep.
and keep in mind from a liability perspective, most of the times to prove someone it's innocent until proven guilty, right?
Yep.
But challenge is most of the times, most of us get caught, regardless small mistakes as kids or adults or whatnot. We get caught because we admit. If you don't
Mm-hmm.
admit, and I'm not saying you're a psychopath or a sociopath or whatever, but like what I'm getting to is like if people do not admit, understand their responsibility or liabilities, it's a moot point, right? You do expect
Yep.
professionals to behave a certain way. Like you go to the doctor and you have open brain surgery or open heart surgery, or you have it, you name it, you have it. It's hard. Like you expect that individual to do all the right things, or the pilots. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
so if I
But
have
there is, on the other hand, like as you said, like there is the conflict of interest problem, right? So, which
correct.
is like actually happens in practice. That.
Right. But that's why if you look at organizations that are really strict about this, they do rotation, right? So they, aside of separation of duty, they do exactly to root all these other risks, right? They will rotate me, and I've been a security analyst for, let's say, 2 years. They'll move my job, and I'll go into, let's say, the data center, physical security or other stuff, because or even faster, sooner, right? Because it basically mitigate some of those risks. Like, did I use my
Yep.
password in another environment? Well, the guy that comes after me or the gal that comes after me, the individual will change the password, or the password will change automatically if you have people changing roles, right, for a particular position. So,
Yep.
or moving people from one side to the other, basically, I still have to make connections if I'm a spy and whatnot. So it basically addresses all these risks associated with just policy. So
Yep.
test your policies.
Let's do the next question. Zero trust architecture. It's another buzzword. It's been around for a while. I think after the buzz is gone, do you think it's a just a buzzword, or do you feel like it's really close to being something of a ultimate network security strategy for companies? Which
Well,
side are you on?
I'm on the zero trust side, and I've dealt with zero trust since what's called the submarine concept. So you pretty much trust someone, but you always check. The zero trust says trust no one and always check. The challenge with that, it makes it from a business perspective very friction heavy. So you have too much
Mm-hmm.
friction for business to operate seemingly. It started in networking, and I've dealt with organizations that are so heavily segmented for all
Mm-hmm.
the right reasons. But that causes from something that will take you 5 minutes to address, it will take you just 10 minutes to log in through all the hops, regardless of how quick those are. So
Mm-hmm.
imagine from incident response perspective, if you don't have people specialized for each environment and access just to that environment, if you have people that cross-pollinate, it's an issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And no one wants to hear that. So zero
Yep.
trust is here to stay, in my opinion. And I'm biased. I work with organizations like Identity Defined Security Alliance, which does deal with zero trust, among other things.
Mm-hmm.
SASE, which is no one wants to hear zero trust and SASE together, secure access, secure edge. With the
Mm-hmm.
distributive compute power and connectivity power, it's something that will evolve. The natural technology will kind of go that direction. And like you said, vendor will always find the niche to address a need from a business perspective. But at the same time, zero trust, I think the main issue I've seen over the years, and like I said, I've dealt with it for a long time, uh, and zero trust effectively, couple of things. First is it's a mindset. It's not a technology. No technology will address all the issues related that evolving around zero trust. That if you have network zero trust and you don't have identity and access management with just in time and a couple of other things, you do not have zero trust. Uh,
Uh-huh.
but then the other part, people expect it to be the silver bullet. No, it's not. Unfortunately, you have to change the mentality and what's good for one organization. Again, back to architecture, back to the basics, right? What's good for one organization may not be good for the other. So you have to focus on not only maturity. Most organizations look by maturity and, oh no, we have to be at maturity level 5. Well, if you're a small business, or even a medium-sized company in this world, do you really need to be as secure as NSA, which we know has
Right.
breaches, has issues? Even then, you spend a lot of money for what gain? So address the issues that are actually pertinent from a maturity perspective to your business, and then
Yep.
deal with and plug address the gaps and plug the holes you have in those areas. Because again, what's fine for maturity level 5 for one organization for you would be literally if you are, let's say, someone needs to fill orders at the cashier or board people in the plane or whatever the case may be, right? You rely on other levels of protection. And I think that's the key takeaway from zero trust. It's layered security. Essentially, that's all it is. You have multiple areas, multiple layers that will provide some measure of we've checked, we know it's trusted, move on. But
Uh-huh.
we took zero trust, and that's why it became a buzzword. And unfortunately, it's kind of a disappointment to the industry, if you will. And adoption is not necessarily because adoption you talk in terms of products, not concepts, right? Probably
Yep.
internet is the concept that's been adopted per se. The rest of it's all
Uh-huh.
moot. What's there is product related. Uh,
Yep.
but if you look at those things, it's hard because people do not understand that the layers will actually address most of these issues. And then you just add
Uh-huh.
the touches. So zero trust, I'd say it's more the finishing touch. If you don't have backups, if you don't have a good recovery policy, if you don't have, if you have great backups, all secured and checked every time, but you never restored anything and your data was corrupt to begin with from a business perspective because you really introduced bad data years ago, but or 2 months ago, and you never realized. But all of a sudden, you have bad trades going south for a financial. Well, you wonder why. Check the
Started
data.
in the
Solid. So you
started
cannot
in the wrong place, basically.
exactly. So I think that's the main challenge with zero trust. One, the
Yep.
conceptual. People don't understand its concept, but then it's relying on other components into the stack. So
Yep.
that's the
Another
challenge.
buzzword that's talked about a lot outside of security, but also in the cybersecurity space, which non-security people don't really know about, is AI. From your perspective, do you see it as something that's more, when you say cybersecurity and AI, do you see that it's more of a threat to cybersecurity, or do you think it's more an enabler for cybersecurity?
So I think it's an enabler first, a threat second. If you've done
Mm-hmm.
the right things, it's an enabler. And again, back to my comment earlier with architecture, right? People don't understand. So AI is not necessarily, it's a lot of software that's doing a lot of analytics and it does a lot, to provide a lot of actuarials and so on. And it's good at processing things way faster than a human can. At the same time, two aspects. Enabler, because humans should still take the decisions. You don't really want AI to shut down your nuclear reactors when you have a heat wave just because, whatever, without a human or humans looking at it. Or same with the planes, right? You have a
Mm-hmm.
AI flying your plane, but the pilot can't overwrite anything. We know what happens when the pilots can't overwrite the system.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually loss. So I think it's an enabler first, a threat second, because the challenge is if it goes and starts being adopted too quick, too fast, it will grow out of control, and people that will come in won't understand anything because basically
Oh, okay.
what
So I see where you're going with this. I guess what I had more in mind with the question is, I guess the way you're looking at it is people are using AI to do things without actually thinking about them, right?
that's one part.
That's one part of it. I think the other part is talking about the human element in cybersecurity and people sort of making mistakes, processes not being checked on and followed through, let's say. Where do you see AI in the future for things that are still all too common ways of infiltrating organizations, doing reconnaissance, taking over email accounts and stuff like that, getting malware through the door, which is a lot of the time still it starts with phishing emails, it starts with people or some bad actors basically impersonating someone or something. That's sort of the part of AI that I was thinking about. I'm not sure if that's sort of where you're heading with it. Hmm?
So it's pretty much there. It's just kind of I looked at it from a broader perspective, if you will. But if you look at that alone, like back business email compromise and spear phishing, like basically targeting high net worth individuals or decision makers, politicians, that's where things are today. That's where
Hmm.
it's simple things, right? Or target the administrators. I think from a where AI can help, definitely it's more an enabler because it could detect patterns easily. You don't have to have a
Hmm.
human detecting patterns or the user, the actual, let's say, executive thinking, oh, what did I do? What did she clicked on? It will be
Hmm.
automatic. It's like a second. You don't send these kind of things, or you've had this is out of pattern. Let's park it, send something to someone and yourself and figure out. So I think from that perspective, it's an enabler. And if you look at hospitals, these days there are organizations that take the triage process, which is really heavy. If you look in a hospital in an emergency room, triage is the one that takes a lot of effort, a lot of resources, and it takes away from the care. Same with
Hmm.
IT. Right? If you have people chasing the wild goose and it proves to be the wrong thing, but the actual attack sneaked underneath as a whatever innocuous email with hey quarter end, I need this signed ASAP, or whatever else other type of lure, then you have a problem, right? So AI can definitely help technologically speaking with alleviating that pain. Could
Yep.
quickly detect the cannot and the other part, and actually the organizations that do this today, and you had it before, threat intel, right? AI can take threat intel feeds. They may not apply to your organization, but if they do, they'll quickly pick it up and automatically enable that for you and not be able to do X, Y, Z. So even 0 days, right? There are
Hmm.
organizations that do this today with at the network level, like basically they prevent outflow traffic, like there's no egress. Everything can come in, but if you try to egress anything, you can't because it's out pattern and it's not an established path of communication. You don't talk to a server on a certain IP, God knows where. So that's
Hmm.
already happening. It's just a matter, I think, of I think it's the fear or whatever VUCA uncertainty and everything in this world
Hmm.
or FUD. It's
Hmm.
essentially technology. People need to understand that it will be used. It's already being used. It's been used for years. Machine learning, it's automation essentially, right? Someone trains a robot to put weldings onto a car frame and so on. It moves on, but the human at the end checks everything. And the human is actually higher trained than the AI part of it. Sure, you can have a human looking at that, train a robot, for example, MIT does this already for the shock stuff. Like all the research is done 24/7. And they actually do and I think one of the NFL teams down in the US is testing those things. It's funny looking helmet with a lot of stuff, but it's absorb the shock. If you look
Hmm.
at object, actually the shock absorption component is like, this is going to poke my head, but apparently not. But AI, it's what does it. So AI, it's
Hmm.
have a room where they set up everything, and AI goes through reams of data, it records everything, video, telemetrics on the actual smashing of the thing. It prints and it corrects through iterative. They are estimating it will take researchers 10 years, 5 years to come to the same conclusion, right? The machine
Yep.
did it in 2 years. Again, lots of smart
Hmm.
people involved and whatnot. And again, if you look at the regular world that we all like to watch, for example, F1 car sports. It's like, yeah, the
Hmm.
F1 cars are really expensive computers on wheels for years, right? I used to work for
Hmm.
one of the companies that was actually doing all the telemetry for F1 cars. And
Hmm.
that 20 some 30 years ago when it wasn't as easy as now. Uh,
Okay.
but that's the part that I think we have to look at the bright side first, but then understand
Hmm.
what could go wrong. And essentially, like I
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, if you don't understand the architecture, at least know where the plug is for the data center and unplug the power. Hopefully, traffic stops. If you don't
Yep.
understand what's going on and what AI does, and you all of a sudden start seeing weird things. But that's kind of where I think it should go.
Just a quick question on this. Everyone's trying to jump on the AI bandwagon, incorporating generative AI into the processes within the organization. But sometimes we've seen that there have been situations where, without wanting to, organizations leaked
Yep.
data because basically they just didn't consider everything this from an architectural perspective, as you're saying. Do you think when we're talking about generative AI as a sole sort of component or sole focus of, which is one of the many things artificial intelligence has been doing for the past decades, really, is there ways you see that companies can use this sort of technology, and you will see, and do you think we can expect there to be more adoption of safe uses of this sort of technology?
I think it will happen. And generative AI, if you are actually a company thinking to scale, just for argument's sake, look at financial industries, right? They are, or healthcare less, but financial industry, just because of the sheer numbers, right? They will do Gen AI. So they'll figure out patterns and improve the pattern to trade. Just that's, I mean, it's happening for some time now with some of the trades, like the high-speed trades and all that that's been banned and all the rest. So if you look at that, Gen AI, it will come not as the next wave, but even like identity and rights management, password, whatnot. I think the main item to, or the main area that organizations will have to keep in mind if they expand the use of AI, it's how much you control and how much someone else that's a shared service controls. If you
Right.
control the content, but someone controls the servers, again, the cloud should be the cloud models that everyone has been pushing for the past 20 years, give and take, should be a prime example as to what shared responsibility means. If you look at there is rarely any breach in the cloud that involves the vendor of the service. It's always the users opening up everything because they need to do stuff and they didn't don't close it. Microsoft and a couple of others. And anyway, we've seen it plenty, right? If you look in the email into the URL, you'll see an S3 or whatever else that's indicative of the actual provider. But that by default is locked down. So if you're thinking to use Gen AI, you have to look at the one share responsibility model if you have anything in the cloud for data storage purposes or whatnot. The other part to it is like basically if it's proprietary data, lock it down. It's a private cloud, it's not a public cloud. If you do it
Yep.
public, you will pay the price no matter what. I've seen government organizations that had their websites, like literally state government agency that had their website redirecting to Vietnam, for example, just for
Hmm.
argument's sake, right? Simple things. But it's financial impact. So you pay something on that particular state agency and you will pay who knows who. But that's fine. I mean, your tax dollars work somewhere else. But aside, Gen AI, it's actually another can of worms because essentially you have a lot of complexity, but not complexity
Hmm.
technologically only. You have business complexity. And at that point, you can go under in no time, regardless of how big you are. I mean, do we have one example already? At least one. It's a big bank that's been around for hundreds of years, and there was one trader that literally traded the bank away. He had so much trading power, and that's 20-ish years ago, give and take, because I was
Hmm.
working for a financial at the time, one of the
Hmm.
big investment companies in this world. And
Yep.
basically, the guy literally traded the firm. That's really AI can do the same thing if
Hmm.
left unchecked. So
Yep.
good luck. And if it's IP, you have to lock it down.
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you. So before we wrap it up, I have one last question for you. We talked about all these things that were sort of from my end. I was directing you sort of to answer the little things that I'm thinking about. But since we are talking about priorities today, if you had to sort of sum it down and to say what's the one piece of advice that you would give to small and mid-sized enterprises and businesses to help them prioritize cybersecurity, what would it be? What would you advise these companies with limited resources to do when it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to the way they prioritize cybersecurity?
So first and foremost, I think the most important part is understand what you're dealing with, what kind of data, what's the lifeblood of your business. If you lose access to your technology, can you still operate? So that would be the first priority. And we've seen actually CrowdStrike and Microsoft incident brought that in full view for large organizations. Small, medium companies are even more prone to it because they don't have the resources. So understand what you can do from a company perspective and don't rely on a mishmash and a really meshed component in the back end from a services perspective that you expect Joe that's on vacation in the Caribbean, and the guy that's done everything for you IT-wise for the past 20 years will be available tomorrow or today
Mm-hmm.
because it's reached. What? So I think prioritization-wise, understand what technology and reliance on technology you have, understand what your people cannot do, and if beside of the people or side of the people understand what your organization is able to achieve if something happens, and then
Mm-hmm.
understand regulatory wise if you're in a regulated industry, but even then if you are dealing with consumer data, understand what's going to actually be the impact from a government agency in the jurisdiction you're operating if you get hit. So at least those three would be the ones that will impact you financially the most, and you can disappear as a business. And then you can go
Mm-hmm.
down the rest of optimizing technology, doing the rest of things and nice to haves. But I think first would be just understand what's the risk for you. Can you not operate with technology? Then understand, do you have the capability or can you have the feature functions and capabilities to address it with someone else? And then ultimately make sure you don't get caught in regulations because you'll be shut down as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that's keeping the
All right.
lights,
Thank you.
quote unquote. Sounds
Thank
good.
you. Thank you for that.
Pleasure.
So I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks so much
Okay.
for making the time, Stefan, today. Um,
Likewise.
it was great having you. I think we'll be seeing each other in another one of our sessions in the future.
Sounds
For
good. Thanks
anyone
so much.
else listening, make sure to tune in for our future episodes where we'll be talking to other cyber leaders and get their opinions about some of these questions that we talked about today and others. If you feel like there's any questions that you feel like would be worth asking today and in the future, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or some other channels, and I'm always happy to discuss. And I'll see you later.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me, David. Take care. All the best.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Stefan.